All right, here we are, everybody. It's my honor, as usual, to welcome everybody to our public collaborative call. Today, we're going to be holding our stress consensus vote, having kind of a first stage kickoff for our elder abuse concepts, touching base on social isolation and intimate partner violence, and then having a technology update. We're very grateful you all are here. I'm Sarah DeSilvi. I am the director of the terminology wing of the Gravity Project. Next slide, please. Thanks for joining. Again, as always, whether you're new or a longtime member, we mute everybody upon entry. This is because there tend to be a lot of us, especially as we roll in at the top of the hour. Please remain muted to avoid background noise, and then the call's being recorded. There's always a recording available on the Confluence after the call. I do try to work the chat, so if you put anything in the chat, send it to everybody. I will do my best to read it out loud and integrate it into the conversation. Again, do send it to everybody, and I'm going to just put this caveat that if you send things to me privately, I am not able to pay attention. So I tend to read those comments out loud too. So it's best to just send it to everybody. And if you have thoughts that are just for me, you can send them to me to an email after the call. Next slide, please. This is our standard antitrust practices slide. Next slide, please. If you've not already done so, we invite everybody to officially join the project at the first link. These links will appear in the chat boxes. Again, we seek consensus for our votes based on our committed members. So joining as a committed member is really important if you want to be part of the formal voting and consensus making process. If you want to check whether to see you've already signed up or if people from your org have signed up, you can review existing membership at the second link. And then, as always, the Gravity Project webpage, Confluence, is a incredibly robust set of information. This includes information on all of our past domains. You'll see as we talk about orientation. If we're working, sorry, that was a very loud noise. If we're discussing domains from that we've already covered in the past, we will focus your attention to the work on the Confluence, and then you can, if you have other questions, you can contact us via email. Next slide, please. This is a slide of our project founders, grants, and in-kind supporters. We are only as strong as our collective, and we're very grateful for those individuals who both offer their labor and offer financial support to the initiative. And there's some further information in future slides about how to become a supporting member if you desire. Next slide, please. So the agenda is a lot of me talking. We do have a technology update in the bit. So we're first going to go through announcements, and then we'll go through a project schedule and overview. We'll have our brief kickoff for elder abuse, a formal kickoff with some of our subject matter experts to come. We are doing an abbreviated kickoff because we do have a packed agenda. We have our stress consensus vote next. There are a couple updates we have to review with you all about that. We'll then go through some items regarding social isolation and loneliness, and our subject matter expert, or one of them, Dr. Holt Lundstedt, will join us. And then just briefly talk about intimate partner violence, screening and diagnoses concepts. Then I will pass the mic to Bob to give a technology update, and then we'll close. Oh, Ryan, one of our subject matter experts from elder abuse is on the call. You're welcome to stay in this meeting, Ron. Again, we're not formally meeting until tomorrow. You're welcome to fall off the call if you desire, or you can stay and see how it runs. Thank you, Ron, for joining. Next slide, please. Next slide. Again, the Gravity Project is currently seeking additional sponsors for our 2021 operations. This is an opportunity to be recognized as a contributor to our critical national work. If you're interested in learning more about sponsoring opportunities, please send an email to the Gravity Project at ENMyAdvisors.net or visit our Confluence. Yeah. Ronnie, you can, if you want to stay on, Ron, you can introduce yourself when we get to your section, or you can, we'll see you tomorrow. We're so grateful. Our elder review subject matter experts are pretty exceptional. Next slide, please. We do want to formally invite everyone to the HL7 Social Determinants of Health Fire ID public meetings. It's kind of the sister to this meeting. In this meeting, as the public meeting, we address everything from our terminology build across all of our domains to tech updates. The meeting on Wednesday afternoons, EST from 3 to 4, is a specific focus on the HL7 Fire Implementation Guide. You can access the meeting calendar at the following link. My colleague Bob Dieterle leads that meeting, where they specifically go into implications of build and implementation. Next slide, please. There are a bunch of presentations coming up. As always, we kind of are everywhere at once. So first of all, Evelyn, our program manager, is presenting at the 2021 State HIT Connect Summit on May 18th. And then I'm going to be presenting to our neighbors to the north. So our Canadian colleagues are just beginning work and trying to consider a gravity-like project in their world. So I'm presenting at a webinar called Incorporating Social Determinants of Health into Digital Health Systems on May 19th. And then I think we did give the link to the upcoming presentations there. Next slide, please. Okay, project schedule and overview. Next slide. This is our, again, increasingly more granular roadmap. So you can see we're kicking off elder reviews today, wrapping up stress with our public vote. And then we'll be carrying through intimate partner violence and social isolation through the end of June. And then we'll be taking our pause and then working again on the intervention concepts and goal concepts on the domains that we've covered this spring. And then after we do the intervention and goals work in the fall, we'll be segueing into those community level domains we've been talking about, kind of holding what we call our parking lot as critical, kind of next level concerns regarding the domains we've covered in the past. So food deserts and food access as the community level experience of food insecurity, and then neighborhood safety. Hi, Mark. It was a private message, but so Julia's making a comment. I think it's really important. I want to elevate it. You do not need to be an expert or even knowledgeable about fire to attend the workgroup meetings. Consider joining if you haven't. Thank you, Julia. I actually want to specifically say we welcome all of our experts in each of your stakeholder representationships to those meetings. So we are intentionally designed with stakeholder representation across payers, across patients, across clinicians, across vendors, so the more we can get our diverse stakeholders to that meeting for the fire implementation guide, regardless of your expertise in tech, the better. Oh, thank you, Marcy. Marcy, the colleague from Canada, is dropping the link to the webinar that we'll be speaking at on the 19th. Next slide, please. So Rose is updating, said a quick note for people who typically join the Fire AG calls. The calls for the next 2 Wednesdays have been canceled due to the Connect-a-thon. And then our next meeting is on June 2nd. Thank you so much, Rose. Just again, a general engagement guide. The intent of public calls is to present updates on gravity materials and offer opportunities for community to reflect and discuss implications. The community has this critical role in ensuring content's representative of needs. We do want to make sure that if you're offering ideas that are different from what's coming to you, because everything that is coming to the public has been shaped in collaboration and conversation with subject matter experts, we do need to hear rationale for differences. So if you're submitting comments with an end-to-end review or have questions in the public call, we do ask to have evidence grounding different approaches so we can make sure we align ourselves with best evidence for our ensuing deliverables. And then if there are any changes, we do want to remind everybody that if the community offers counterpoint, we do have to fold it back to our subject matter experts before it becomes part of the public master. The subject matter experts basically ground all the work that we do. Next slide, please. And I already mentioned this, so if you have questions regarding content we've covered in previous builds, you can either review materials on the Confluence or reach out to us individually by email, and we will talk to you one-on-one. Next slide, please. Any questions on the schedule and updates? Okay, next slide. Terminology, next slide. Although the initial roadmap was our former presentation, this is us trying to give our representation of our roadmap with our icons just for consistency. You'll be seeing over time some clarification of some of our domain headings as we work with our colleagues in the FHIR implementation guide and on the in order to create naming consensus. For instance, as you look across Confluence and the implementation guide slides, you'll see that we've refined slightly the name of education as a domain to be educational attainment. Veteran is veteran status and unemployment is unemployment status. These all align with federal approaches. As always, we try to anchor ourselves with the any federal approaches to naming and definitions when we can. You'll see here what I said before, working on screening and diagnoses now, taking a break, and then working on goals and interventions in the fall. Next slide, please. Here we are, 513, kicking off elder abuse ever so briefly, just kind of presenting initial orientation based on our conversations with the subject matter experts. We'll go deeper into that next week when our agenda is not so robust. Covering having our stress consensus vote, covering some concepts of social isolation, and then basically just letting you know where we're at with intimate partner violence. And then there is no vote next time because we do want to have some work to do with social isolation, getting that master set. You'll hear why very shortly. And then we'll be voting on some of our concepts again on June 10th. Next slide, please. Identify, next slide. Just a brief elder abuse kickoff, and then Ron, if you do want to say anything much wiser than I can, you're welcome to unmute yourself. But we just wanted to let everybody know and keep to our timeline. We wanted to keep to our timeline and just give an orientation of the concept of elder abuse and where we are so far. Next slide. I just want to give everybody a baseline grounding. In every single domain that we cover, we do try to let everybody know the evidentiary anchors of the work that we're doing. Like for instance, you know, with our subject matter experts or working with HUD or working with USDA, we always try to show where the base or the expertise lies. So much of the work of the next months builds off of a couple different national efforts, of which the people who are subject matter experts were experts within, like primary authors and actors in each of these initiatives. One is the Adult Maltreatment Screening and Assessment Tools Inventory that came out of the ACL. National Center for on Elder Abuse, and then the other is the Elder Abuse Surveillance Uniform Definitions and Recommended Core Data Elements paper. So there already are these two kind of grounding papers that focus our work, and so the work of developing the master for elder abuse is kind of, so much of that yeoman's work has already been done ahead of us. The Administration of Community Living, that's ACL. And then, so it's the Administration of Community Living, National Center on Elder Abuse. We're lucky to have ACL help across Gravity. So Kelly Cronin sits on our executive committee, and they have been incredibly helpful across our different domains, especially in work on the Older Adults American Act and areas agencies on aging. I don't know if I know the second question, the what is that question? So if you can type if you can let me know what the second question is, that'd be great. Oh, yeah, Administration for Community Living. There you go. Thanks, Joy, for answering it again. Yes.
So what is that? Or could you put a link in the chat for those of us who are not familiar with this agency?
Absolutely, absolutely. I actually feel like if you go to the first link, the National Center for Elder Abuse, That is a division of ACL. So, and it is a federal government agency. So if you follow the first link, it will take you backwards to ACL in general. It's akin to like divisions of the CDC. Thank you, Joy. Look, Joy's being so helpful. um, uh, thank you so much. Um, any other questions on this slide? Okay, next slide, please. Um, all right, so this is just a general, again, prevalence statistic. This came off the ACL website. So at least 1 in 10, but 1 in 10 community-dwelling older adults experienced some form of abuse in the prior year. There are different subtypes, and this is actually better explained on the next slide. Next slide, please. Again, this is driven by the expertise of our subject matter experts, but akin to our previous work, Gravity and its not subject matter expertise puts things on timelines, and then once we get into them, they become far more complex. You can see this echoing across our work with social isolation and social connection as well. So as we work on elder abuse, part of the work, what we'll be referencing with our subject matter experts is whether or not we are addressing all of these different types of abuse at once, or whether we're focusing on a specific one. So there are these different subtypes of abuse. So we have our first collective subject matter expert meeting tomorrow. And we're really just going to make choices about what we feel like is priority for doing work over the next few months, given the constraints on our timeline.
So are you saying, Sarah, that ultimately this entire list will not actually be the Gravity agenda?
No, I'm saying we may make choices in order to complete the work by the end of June. We'll do our best. But in order to be thorough, we might focus on a specific subtype for now, but eventually complete everything per our usual method. You know, our domains tend to multiply once we're within them. Oh, thank you, Ron. Our domains tend to multiply once we're within them, and you can see that again with social isolation. We are committed to addressing all of these. I just try to be kind of rational regarding the time constraints of doing this well, because we're more bound. We are more deeply bound to doing it correctly. So if we again, we're having our first collective meeting tomorrow, but I just want to reference the fact that we do. It might be that before the end of June, we don't cover every single one of these subtypes and focus on a few.
So is there time in this meeting for comment from 122 participants on our view of priorities here?
I think probably given the agenda, if we can reflect on this and then bring those conversations to the next meeting, that would be lovely. Only
you.
because we do have to get through the stress vote and all of the other elements of the agenda. Is that okay?
Has to be.
No, it doesn't. Okay.
I mean, you're having your first meeting with the subject matter experts tomorrow,
Yeah,
but
so
the whole point of our meetings is sort of community input into the ongoing agenda. So I was hoping for maybe 5 or 10 minutes for people to be able to comment from their own perspectives, of which we have a great many on this call in terms of priorities. And then you could take that to the subject matter experts and see if there's any match or not, and
well, I
then come
think
back to us about what to do.
Well, I think actually, given the fact that we haven't even talked about it with the collective, I'd rather see whether there's even pressures that we can't cover all of these before I have that conversation, if that's okay. Like and again, maybe if we have time, we can get to it at the end, but maybe we'll meet tomorrow and everyone will be like, oh, we got it all. We're good. Right. And that's entirely possible. So if we do have constraints on the timeline, I promise to bring them back to the collective at the next meeting. And then we can,
Okay.
in the meantime, we can think about what our priorities might be and come into that conversation prepared.
Thank you.
All right. Next slide, please. These are our stellar subject matter experts. I gleaned from pictures from LinkedIn and from university web pages. So we have Dr. Ron Asierno, We have Dr. Jason Burnett. We have Dr. Zach Kasumis, I think this is the right way to pronounce his name, and Dr. Carl Pillemer. So again, we're meeting tomorrow, and we'll be meeting weekly with our subject matter experts to gather and review these screening and diagnoses concepts. And we will have the option to survey the collective later. So Linnell is asking me again, I'm sorry, it's hard when people send messages to me privately. I don't even know whether there will be constraints on our labor. So if there are, we promise to engage the community and our strategic advisory committee and the EC, all of our collectives, in order to figure out what is a priority for the group. All right, any other questions? Wonderful. Next slide, please. That was a very, very brief overview. Again, just kind of orient you to the work ahead. And you'll be seeing much more come out, especially you'll be seeing the master list bloom over the course of the next few weeks. Next slide, please. All right, so we're now going to go into the stress vote. And again, this is partly why our agenda is so tight. There's a lot of things to do today. And again, if we can have a conversation regarding priorities today, that'd be wonderful. But we do have a lot to get through. Next slide, please. All right, the stress consensus vote is today, as announced. And we're going to do a couple highlights and answer a couple questions regarding changes, and then go into our voting period, which again is asynchronous and lasts from now until tomorrow afternoon. Next slide, please. Again, our types of stress were driven by the Stress Measurement Network and our work with our subject matter experts, Dr. Eric Prather and his team. We did get a comment regarding different types of stress that might be relevant. There was a really lovely email exchange regarding the role of minority stress and discrimination, especially in the current pandemic and what we're seeing regarding the effects of racism and health inequities. We did make an early call to hold the stress of minority stress and discrimination for our work in racism, discrimination, and bias that we're covering likely now at the end of this year or in early 2022. So that is the reason why this particular experience is excluded from the master list as you see it now. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that. Again, that was an early decision that we made collectively. We do want to make sure we have the right people at the table to have that conversation well. And our subject matter experts, as we had gathered them, weren't the best subject matter experts to address that concept. And again, it tied very nicely in with our work on racism, discrimination, and bias that we intend to do justice for in the upcoming work. Next slide, please. Again, just grounding. This is actually quite important when it comes to when you come to see some of our new diagnostic comments. Whenever there is a gold standard screening tool, it is the anchor of our work. This is the same way it was with the USDA food security modules. You also can see this in the American Housing Survey questions that are in test right now. They're doing the cognitive testing for a housing insecurity survey through HUD. So a lot of those questions were part of our work with housing instability and homelessness. So this perceived stress scale in all of its forms is the gold standard in this world. And you can see it across the master file and all of its different versions. When you're looking at the master, this is there in all, I think it's like 3 different versions or 4 different versions as the anchor of the set. Again, it's important to consider the role of gold standard tools when we look ahead into quality measure development, because they will likely have to reference these kinds of tools in order to measure change. Next slide, please. Again, these are other tools we have on there. So the Prepare tool, the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health and Occupational Stress questionnaire, the NAINS question, and then SEEK. Next slide, please. And there's a specific update on the diagnoses I want to sit with. Again, we published this master list a bit early, but since we're voting on it, I do want to make sure that people feel and understand what we're voting on and why. There is a new concept, a new finding on the diagnoses for stress, which is high stress as identified by the perceived stress scale. And I am going to talk about that on the next slide, but I want to highlight it here. And then everything you see here on the existing stress diagnoses list is they're all existing concepts in SNOMED or ICD-10-CN, so our two existent diagnostic terminologies. On this spreadsheet as well are parent concepts, like stress as a parent concept in SNOMED CT, of which there are many children. So on this diagnosis list, some of the terms that might be a little bit challenging, like what does increased stress mean, or what does stress overload mean, those are children of parents that are quite solid. So when we do our work with SNOMED, we will be doing work trying to figure out how to address existent terminology within SNOMED CT that might not be very clear. And we don't hold the definitions for them because we did not submit them in the past. But the specific request of high stress as identified by perceived stress scale is a specific request. So what drives the requirements for the creation and use of terminology concepts, for example, are separate requirements driving the inclusion of stress versus emotional stress versus feeling stressed. You're thinking about implementation, I imagine. So we're only working in psychological stress at this time. So at this point, I'm just trying to figure out what you're meaning, Corey. Like, why would one choose stress versus choose emotional stress versus choose feeling stress? Is that your question?
Yes, Sarah, I think that's the gist of it, is sort of how am I, which one am I supposed to choose? They seem similar to me as a non-subject matter expert.
Yeah, so this is actually, and you're correct, they even seem similar to the subject matter experts. This is one of the tricky situations we find ourselves here in Gravity, is that we are faced with a proliferation of codes in SNOMED CT that are not necessarily as specific as we might like. So part of what we work on when we work with SNOMED is trying to glean and winnow when things are unclear as well, but we can't, in the meantime, we're kind of bound to include anything that is a logical child and meets the criteria as a possible outcome of one of our tools. And again, we are only focusing on psychological stress at this time. And so given with our subject matter experts lens, all of these concepts are possible outcomes from looking at psychological stress and the tools that we've employed. So I don't know if I think this is part of what we're hoping to find in our implementation and pilots, is how to winnow and trim this and the evidence and kickback we need to do so. When we initially had our gathering in 2017 regarding the creation of SDOH terminology and the need for interoperability, the need to trim was one of those things that we identified, not just filling gaps. And you can see there's only one new concept we're suggesting. I don't know if that was an answer. It was more of a we identified that the subject matter experts identified that these concepts could be or could logically be applied as the outcome of any of the screening tools that were in the screening set.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know you have a lot to cover here, so thanks for.
No, but I do want to make sure we answer your questions, though.
So Sarah, is it right to assume that the creation of useful value sets, things like that, come at the implementation end of the work? We're sort of saying, what's the universe of concepts now? And then later on, we'll move to, are there code sets specific to certain use cases, and how do we promote those to encourage interoperability and good workflow?
Well, I think actually there's the way we talk about it in the Gravity project is you can imagine things getting ever more constrained, right? So like for instance, I think we are becoming more sophisticated as a collective 2 years in, right? So this level of these concepts all apply and could be a diagnosis of stress. They're not incongruous. Is the same approach we've taken for some time, right? I think the problem is that there's just too many of them, and we do need to work with SNOMED CT to see if we can retire some of them, right? But all of them are either suitable parents that have mapped to existent ICD-10-CM codes, or they're children that are perhaps unclear that we might need to ask SNOMED CT to winnow. But it is so, I do want to state that the value set that we initially build off this domain will have, it will be consistent with the domain, but as we work and become more sophisticated, we can imagine constraining and tightening it down as we do. And this might mean that actually that some of the screening tools that we've identified in the past as being okay, might fall out as we become more sophisticated. I mean, there's all kinds of things that might happen as we do an initial approach and then kind of tighten it out over time. And I want to state too, part of the complexity of this work also is that the science of the domains in some of these areas is quite young, right? So not all, like having a lot of stress is not always a bad thing, right? So in sitting with the work of the subject matter experts, and trying to figure out how to even represent acuity, it's a very, the work of stress and stress science is pretty complex. So this is why anchoring their perception of what was kind of necessary to intervene on was really regarding binding it to this gold standard tool of the perceived stress scale. And then Therese, we're not, at this time, we're actually just talking about severity. We're not talking about temporality. This is actually akin to how we've approached other domains in the past. We think about our work with food insecurity. Again, in this stage of the science, focusing on identifying severity for right now. And imagining, again, in time, once we've become more sophisticated as a science and once our terminology once we learn some things with implementation, adding temporal modifiers in the future, just as we think about doing with some of the economic-driven social risks that we've talked about in the past. And if there's thoughts that so this is the same set that's been present for some time, right? This is the same. These diagnoses haven't changed except for the addition of this high stress one we'll talk about next. If there's thoughts that this is really too excessive and it needs to be trimmed, because again, we've taken the same approach as we have before, that these are consistent with the domain. If there's thoughts that we need to tighten them up by removing possibly some of the children that are like non-specified or unclear, we're happy to examine that and work with SNOMED CT on that, because that's already something we're planning on doing.
And Sarah, one additional question about the new code, the high stress as identified by a specific scale. That's a bit odd as a diagnosis. I can understand that as a finding, but like, a diagnosis of breast cancer doesn't have appended to it as found on a particular slide. That's more the finding. So high stress is the diagnosis that's made based on a specific scale, but the scale built into the diagnosis feels to me like a very heavily pre-coordinated notion.
That is the only approach that SNOMED approves at this time. So much so that we can imagine actually having, I think the argument is based on where they're standing with a need for semantic consistency. I think, and that they will agree with you, that some of these vague terms that are not bound and could be differently applied depending on perception would need to be retired. So this mirrors concepts that we see in depression screening, like PHQ-9. This is the approach they are asking, and we're going to see this actually. This is the approach they're asking us to take with food insecurity as well. They are only supporting pre-coordinated, bound by gold standard tools until there are reference to diagnostic criteria and the science meets the science of semantic consistency by knowledge and application of criteria is able to support the goal of semantic consistency. That was a long statement, but this is all that they feel comfortable doing. This is the only way for all of our domains now, that we're going to be able to identify severity for triage. this is their, yes, this is the way. And this actually kind of goes along with what Teresa was stating, which is what about positive stress? Because with the measurement of stress, it's really a continuum, right? So, like being positive for stress is like that's like many of us, but actually having health risks and concerns that need to be monitored and identified, that's a whole other thing. So it's really hard to use a positive and negative, dichotomy that's not supported by the literature, and it's not something the subject matter experts could support. So this was really where the subject matter experts and SNOMED and our approach going forward merged, was again with binding to the scale, which has normative statements of what's concerning, and trying to go forward with that approach. I know it's pre-coordinated. This is really important to get this right before we go into vote. Again, so the only thing that's new is this high stress as identified by perceived stress scale. If we go to the next slide, you might see there's a little bit more about it. So again, like this is the approach to severity across SNOMED build now. And many of you remember from the ICD-10 submission, for similar reasons, the CDC did not support us building mild, moderate, and severe food insecurity into ICD-10-CM because of the capacity for misapplication of the severity. So we tried to have the severity built into SNOMED CT, and this was the way that they felt comfortable representing severity, was in binding to the tool. So Jim's asking if there's a procedure code for screens for stress. We haven't done screening procedure codes so far. We've been utilizing the activity of screening in our LOINC terminology and our screening questions and answers. We have no precedent in doing screening terminology for procedures. We could, if you want to suggest that, though, we could consider it, but we identified that as something we thought about in the past, and then it's not currently a part of our approach. Any other questions? This is important as we go into vote to make sure everyone is on the same page.
So Mike, can I follow up with my question?
Yes.
So if those concepts we were just seeing in the last slide were all conditions, meaning they're just like forms of diagnoses, is that only capturing the positive end of the spectrum for diagnosis of stress conditions or stress disorders?
Oh, so you're asking whether we have the normative statement as in no stress?
Yes, or
low stress?
some other, or like something to denote at the event of screening. So if somebody was screened for it, the answer was no, not stress, or a low number on the perceived stress scale or something like that. Then,
oh, we will have yeah, we can imagine you want the for the technical approach, you want the opposite answer, right? Which is
yes. Well, more like something to indicate the denominator of is this
so maybe it's that, yeah, so that is something, so maybe you and I can take that conversation offline, and I can talk to you about how we've approached that in the past. I know Monique's on the call, so when specifically regarding the IG, I know we approach that in a few different ways.
I see. For the perceived stress scale, how would that be captured? Is that a measurement, or?
Yes. So the perceived stress scale is the gold standard tool for this domain. It will be eventually built into LOINC. And so you will have answers within LOINC. And this is why this is the approach we've taken in the past, is like, so you'll have your negative answer, right? You'll have the result of the screening being null or non-concerning as part of the utilization of the tool in LOINC in the build.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, thanks.
And there was conversation in how we can marry these the finding tools in SNOMED with the eventual assessments, interpretation statements and LOINC tools we were talking about was SNOMED on Tuesday, right? Really trying to make it really tight, right? So if we have interpretation comments within LOINC, they would marry and match with what we have here in SNOMED and we're suggesting. This is all very technical, but I hope that's so this is any other questions regarding, so the only new thing is this high stress is identified by perceived stress scale. There are no other changes in the master over the last couple weeks, right? So really the last month or so, it's been kind of static because this was what we presented to you for a little bit. The rationale for the inclusion in those slightly vague children is that they are children of parents which are, we haven't been able to say are out yet, but if we have a sufficient argument and conversation with SNOMED, we would love to make that case. So if it's okay, we'll proceed into the vote because we do need to get that done and proceed to the rest of the agenda. We do have, if that's all right. And again, if you have any further thoughts on this, and again, I'm sorry, it feels like we're having such a robust conversation at the 11th hour. So again, the high stress as identified by perceived stress scale is the only new concept on the master for some time. But if you have any further thoughts that you feel like need to be considered, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about the voting methodology, right? So the definition has not changed either. So this is the definition, again, adapted from Lazarus and Folkman. And then it's really important to note that it's not the presence of stressors, it's the perception of demand that indicates the concerns in the literature, right? So you could have all kinds of stressors in your environment, but it's the perception of the demand greater than the ability to meet, mitigate, or alter those demands. That is the kicker here in the literature. Again, taking the literature basis because we are developing health terminology. Next slide, please. Again, I wanted to settle here because if there is something you feel like, these are the different voting possibilities. Yes means that it's not ideal, but it's better to move forward than block the deliverable. Every yes with comment is worked into the framework. We don't necessarily do exactly what the comment suggests because we get different comments and we have to bring every comment back to the subject matter experts. So this is just something to consider. If you feel like there's something you want to elevate or you're concerned by, we can bring that back to the subject matter expert and then you get an answer. So if every yes with comment requires an email comment to gravity@emiadvisors.net by 5/20/2021. A formal objection also requires a comment, and it needs to include a path to address the objection. So if you offer a formal objection, you have to alternate to alternative. Those formal objections without a comment is just considered an abstention. And again, you have to email those comments by 5/20/2021. And then an abstention is when a member declines to vote. Any questions regarding the stress master list? And I'm sorry if it feels like that's, if anyone has any concerns, just let me know right now. But it's I hope the master list as it's been presented to the community over the last month or so is intelligible, and I hope our approach is understandable as we go forward. Again, understanding the pre-coordination of the high stress identified by the perceived stress scale. That is just the lay of the land for SNOMED right now, based on what they're willing to build. So any questions going into consensus voting? I do want to state that we are working to have input from SNOMED before you vote, so that we know we're voting on something that is has the possibility of being approved, right? We're really trying to make sure that when the community reviews things, it's really close to what we'll be working on with SNOMED and ICD-10-CM. All right, next slide, please. So there's a Google poll, just like last time. The link will fall into the into the chat if you want to email us specifically asking for the link to the Google poll. You're welcome to. We've done that for members before who have a hard time navigating during the meeting. I know that I would myself, right? So if you want to email us, that's fine. There's a form to do the Google poll. It has to be completed by 5 p.m. EST tomorrow. Again, the stress master list is available on the Confluence for review. Please remember to press submit before your answers will not be recorded. Any Gravity team members, of course, have to vote as well because we are committed members and count in the consensus. And Janice, I believe the links above are the live links. So that first link is is where you vote, and the second link is the master list. And then there's a detail on the email. Any other questions regarding voting before we go into a social isolation update? I know it's already 1/4 of. Oh, it's not a live link? It is for me. Yeah, so it seems to be working for me. And then Janice, you know, if anybody has any problems, we are very receptive. Just send us an email and we'll send you a link in an email. Absolutely. We do not want to have any barriers at all. All right, so again, we are going to trust that if you have problems accessing the vote, if you email us, because I don't think we can track everybody in the chat who's saying that they can't access that. How are objections managed? Do they get voted on again by the community? We have resolved objections in turn. So far, any formal objection, first of all, the consensus is still the consensus. So if the consensus is that it passes, then it passes. Formal objections are resolved intentionally, and if there's significant changes to the content, it does involve bringing things back to the community because any significant changes to the master list would have to be addressed by the community at large. But remember, any formal objection requires a plan for how it would have to be addressed. A formal objection without a plan to address your concern is an abstention. All right. Okay, so I'm going to try to get to the content because we do have a social isolation presentation coming up next, and we have our amazing subject matter expert, Dr. Holt Lundstedt, on the call. All right, thank you, everybody. Next slide, please. And next slide. And next slide. I'm going to quickly go through and try to get to Dr. Holt Lundstedt's presentation. Next slide. Again, these are our amazing subject matter experts, Dr. Eddie Garcia from the Foundation for Social Connection and Dr. Julianne Holt Lundstedt. We're meeting every other week to review the screening and diagnoses concepts. Again, similarly to the elder abuse domain, we have identified a need to kind of consider our social isolation concept within a meta concept. And Dr. Holt Lundstedt is going to present on that in a second. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a baseline social isolation screener. You'll see the master blooming very shortly on the Confluence. Next slide. These are some more social isolation and loneliness screening concepts. Next slide. And this is where we segue, right? So in our conversations with Dr. Holt Lundstedt, even though we have social isolation on our roadmap, social isolation is within the context of social connection subtypes that she's going to present on very shortly. Again, similarly to elder abuse, we've identified social isolation. We're going to finish social isolation by June with our intent to be thorough. We will likely have to address the other concepts in order to do due diligence. So just to answer Lucy's question prior, all of the elder abuse subtypes will be addressed by gravity and time. Absolutely, we're committed. This is what we do. But when we think about addressing things prior to that June deadline, we might prioritize one of those subtypes. So similarly here, Dr. Holt-Lunstad is going to present on the different of the context of social isolation within social connection, and how we're focusing on social isolation in order to really complete our obligations for our contract before the end of June, but we'll be covering those other concepts. Dr. Holt-Lunstad, are you able to hear me and present? Are you still here?
I am still here.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to pass.
Okay, the sound cut out for me, so I'm not sure if others can hear me, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
We can
hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Okay. So really what I wanted to show you is, in essence, one of the challenges that we ran into, similar to some of these other concepts that we were just talking about, and that is just how wide to cast the net. And so this first figure here really shows, this comes from a publication on social isolation and loneliness that was a review of systematic reviews, and identified, I believe, around 62 different measurement tools, and how they vary in the degree of subjectivity asked of participants, but also in terms of the structure and function that they assess. And similarly, based on meta-analytic data, we find that when we look at the large-scale studies that link these related concepts, that they are all significantly related to health outcomes. This slide in particular is related to mortality. But what these related concepts tend to, so you can see things like, receive social support, perceptions of support, to things like social networks and social integration, social isolation. But they fall under general categories of functional, structural, and quality. And so really, this has led several to argue for a multifactorial umbrella term of social connection that encompasses the way in which our social relationships, or lack thereof, can influence health outcomes. And so social isolation and loneliness can fall under these. And so, for instance, the structural aspects of how we connect to others really gets at the existence of relationships and roles. And so here are just some examples of different types of measurement approaches. Whereas the functional aspects of the way in which we connect to others may be related to the functions provided by or are perceived to be available because of our social relationships. And then finally, there is the quality or the affective positive and negative aspects of relationships. And so really, while there can be some overlap in these, they are not typically highly correlated, suggesting that they may contribute to risk uniquely. But just conceptually, a way to think about this is that the structural aspects really get at the existence of others in our lives. And so, of course, having those relationships makes it more likely that you may be able to count on others for support. And that support, may be associated with greater relationship satisfaction. However, just because we have people in our lives doesn't necessarily mean that we can count on them. And even if we can count on certain relationships, doesn't necessarily mean that that doesn't come with potential strain or conflict or nagging, that sort of thing, all of which may contribute to health outcomes. And so Sarah asked me to just simply present this because social isolation and loneliness fall under this, but there is, this casts somewhat of a larger net than just if we were to focus just on isolation. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holt-Lunstad. Any questions from the collective? Dr. Holt-Lunstad, Lucy Johns has a question. Lots of chatter now in the media around about computer-enabled connection, positive and negative. Could this be added to structural? I was wondering your thoughts on that.
So many of the tech-based ways of connecting socially aren't often included in some of the more older standard validated instruments. However, newer instruments or modifications of existing instruments to include that type of connecting socially certainly is emerging in literature, and certainly could be added in terms of not only the structural component in terms of how frequently we have contact with others, or the kinds of relationships, but could potentially fall under functional as well, the extent to which we can rely on others in or social media types of sources for advice or guidance, or and of course this goes beyond social media as well to other kinds of tech-based social connection. So they certainly could be added under these components, but wouldn't necessarily be limited just to the structural component.
Thank you. I was thinking in particular for adolescents and for the chronically ill.
Yeah, and so, for instance, there is some research out there looking at the extent to which particularly those who may have stigmatizing conditions may be able to rely on support through online support groups, which certainly is relevant.
Definitely a good use case.
Wonderful. Any other? There's a lot of conversation regarding tech in our interventions and goals work too. We have the expertise of our LTPAC, long-term and post-acute care colleagues to offer in when we get to that, and the utilization of technology in addressing social isolation. I really look forward to sharing that with you in future meetings. Dr. Holt-Lunstad, thank you so much. So I hope that was clear. So the point, the intent was really to show the lay of the land again. So if we only address social isolation, we're missing critical concepts that are critical for health risk. So we do need to expand our field there. So Dr. Holt-Lunstad's orienting us to that. And then almost the inverse with elder abuse, where we do need to cover every single one of those sub-concepts, but for the focus of our contract, we might need to focus specifically on one and then address all the others in time. Again, with Gravity, we commit to doing what's necessary. So there is not a single element of our subdomain that we will ignore. So it all will be addressed. It's just about a matter of timing. And just understanding resources to do the work, but we're committed to doing all the work that our subject matter experts and the literature identifies as critical.
I'm sorry, could I jump in real quickly? I've tried to write a comment 3 times, but every time the screen changes, it deletes the comment before I can enter.
No.
I was wondering if you see any utility in documenting causation in relation to social isolation or the perception of loneliness. It kind of builds on what I think Lucy was just saying, social isolation due to physical disability, a perception of loneliness related to sexual orientation or gender identity.
Dr. Holt-Lunstead, if you're still on, do you have time to answer that? Like, I think that that's a really fascinating idea, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are with that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope first of all that I've understood the question correctly, and what I understood it to mean is a way to identify or document the underlying cause of isolation or loneliness. So someone might be isolated or lonely because of, for instance, hearing loss, versus someone whose isolation or loneliness may be due to a different kind of health condition, or a loss of a spouse, or some other life transition, and that it is consistent with the National Academy of Science consensus report that interventions should be tailored to the needs and underlying causes, because some kinds of interventions will be more effective if addressing those underlying causes. And so I think that would be fantastic if there's a way to do that. But I'm still getting familiar with this system. Maybe Sarah can jump in on how that's done.
Well, we do in health terminology all the time, right? So I can imagine once we have the terminology for these concepts identified, we'll be able to establish causality and then better address interventions. So I think this is one of the complexities of doing these domains, and this is actually very much akin to what Dr. Prather was coming out with within our stress work, is that, stress, again, not saying this regarding social isolation, but stress is an initial finding that by necessity requires further assessment to figure out what you're actually fixing, right? So even though he's a stress expert, he was like, what will you do with this information, right? And my response was, honestly, we're bound to address it because we had to figure out a way forward to address this domain in our timeline. But he was very honest that this is the beginning of a story, right? So figuring out that someone is stressed, or figuring out that someone is suffering for social isolation, is the beginning of a story. And then there will be assessment of causality in order to figure out what to do.
Hi, this is Dr. Miller. I wanted to comment.
Hello, yes.
Are we considering the subcategory of social isolation in adolescence that even might be accompanied by bullying? It's such a high risk for adolescent suicide, or worse, adolescents becoming gun-toting mass murderers. So I'm just wondering if it's so incredibly impactful as a social determinant of health. Just wondering if it's being considered. Certainly it's beyond the LTPAC population, and I think we should look at it.
Yeah, no, we do, so I think that actually is fairly critical. So Dr. Holt-Lunstead, any comments there, or should I pipe in? I just want to yield the floor to you since you're the SME.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fully agree. And I think that's what prompted this presentation in the first place, was that there are so many related concepts that are incredibly important, and we don't want to miss, but also wasn't sure if it was beyond our scope or task. And so that's what led to lots of questions from me to Sarah that led to this.
No, yeah, I think that's a very good explanation, actually. So, so Holly, Dr. Miller, yes, the intent is to actually, as we do in Gravity, really trying to expand our scope to encompass all the domains of risk as we see them. So look forward to the community's collaboration. And again, if there's critical materials or approaches that we need to consider, happy to have conversations one-on-one, and happy to receive submissions from the community through the submission process. I do want to state just a general, so I'm faculty in pediatrics and I'm family medicine myself. We've yet to fully address the complexity of pediatrics in our work at Gravity. I do feel like that's just something that I want to acknowledge. We have, in some of our domains, done quite well. because there are existing approaches that allow us to kind of ground our terminology, such as the USDA approaches for screening for food insecurity. But there is, a critical need, and maybe even like a need to have a focused pediatric push to really assess the completeness and relevance and sufficiency of our terminology when it comes to addressing pediatric patients and any technological sequelae of doing that well. Ooh.
Thank you. I'm pleased to hear that.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I do. One of the things I can commit to at Gravity is that we are committed to doing this well. To say that things are paused is never that they're not happening, right? So we've talked in the past about how things get on the timeline. It just our being bound by doing it correctly sometimes means that it takes time. So right now we're in this world and want to make sure we do this world well. And we're grateful for Dr. Holt-Lunstad for having us back up a little bit to make sure we did it better. All right, I think that we're good on this. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Holt-Lunstad. We are so grateful. This all came out of the conversation that we had the last subject matter expert huddle. So thank you so much for that. And I think that this is the end of this. And I know we do have time built into an hour and a half, but I don't know if folks, it looks like we still have quite a bit of folks on the call. But yes, 105 to be exact. So I believe we can kind of step forward onto our next slides. Thank you so much. I have to be honest, I'm trying to figure out where the conversation regarding marital status came from. I missed that. So if someone can highlight that for me, there's a really interesting conversation between Lucy and Marcy that I want to make sure I represent well. And I did respond to Lucy's comment regarding the representation on the panel. So Gravity does an initial query for any subject matter expertise, and then we assess and augment as so there's lots of work going on in that space right now to make sure we have representation. We did that with IPV as well to make sure we didn't miss the LGBTQIA perspective, given the risks, especially to trans individuals with IPV. So we are in the process and always trying to make sure that we have representation across our experts in our work. And then if there's something I need to know regarding the marital status thing, let me know. Maybe fill me in. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's Marcy here. I've just seen it a couple of times on on last week's presentation, and then also from Dr. Holt-Lunstad's presentation around marital status. And so, is there another term that doesn't focus more on marital status, but chosen family or family status instead? And I don't know if that actually fits within the social isolation part at this point. So.
Well, yeah, and I guess if she's still on the call, we can ask her. But also, I think it's difficult because sometimes it's about the measurement that was applied to the literature at the time. So I do agree we need to think inclusively, absolutely. And so I'll bring that actually, if she's not on the call, or maybe what I'll do is I'll bring that. Well, we have a meeting next week, right after right after this time next week. We have a meeting, and I'll talk about that with her and bring it back.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Okay. All right, next slide, please. This is quick, and then off to Bob. Next slide. So we meet also weekly with our IPV experts. The subject matter experts have the initial master in review. It includes our global assessment of screening tools for intimate partner violence. We have representation from Fenway Health. We're incredibly grateful for their work there. Folding in new voices as well. So Fenway kind of comes with a body of folk. So there's a lot of people coming in, and Chris Grasso is kind of the face of that, but there's a lot of people coming behind her. And then we also have Lisa James from Futures Without Violence, which is what you remember her from the Kickoff. And again, so expect a master list coming to you in short order. And I'm just going to note that once we complete this stress vote, intimate partner violence, elder abuse, and social isolation are our final 3 domains as we head into the end of June. We have done incredible work. It is fairly overwhelming, but we're very, very grateful for all of your engagement. Next slide, please. On to Bob. Here we go. Are you still with us, Bob? Or did we lose him? I don't know. Is he still on? Is he quiet? Hooray for Fenway, indeed. Sarah B, can you tell if Bob is on?
I can see him on, Sarah. This is Rose.
Hi, Rose.
Hi, but I don't see a microphone beside his name. So I'm wondering if he's calling in separately and if
I'm so good at filling space, but I think I have said all the things I can possibly say, except for the fact that as Bob waits, we could talk about priorities for elder abuse subdomains. I know. I mean,
I can talk about the Connectathon.
That's great. Okay, that sounds wonderful. And again, the plan for the subtopics is to assess with the elder abuse SMEs whether we can assess everything, and if we can, no need to even come back and bring it to the community. So passing on the mic briefly to Evelyn.
Oh, Bob is on. Okay, Bob, go ahead.
I was on before. I could hear you, but you couldn't hear me. Okay, I dialed in again. So Sarah, thank you very much. Incredible presentation and great feedback from the community. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to try to do the things you've already seen very briefly, and we'll touch some things that are new at the end. As you know, we've validated a framework implementation guide to support the work that Sarah is doing and the ability to exchange the various terminologies related to and activities related to social determinants of health. Next slide, please. We work to make sure that we have intersection between the various activities and the terminologies that are being developed. In particular, the work that's being done right now around light-coded surveys. There's a question before as to how those get represented, ultimately as observations where the question and answer are a pair. And if there's more than one selection, then we have the ability to support that also. We have the ability to go and compute health concerns based on the intent of the survey, and ultimately to promote those to problems on a problem list where appropriate. Defining goals that are set by the individual or the individual and the provider working together. And then to define interventions or referrals and ultimately to track what was done on behalf of the patient as procedures that have been performed or text that's associated with the outcome. We have the ability to support a consent communication between organizations, as well as the ability to aggregate information for reporting purposes. Next slide, please. I'm only going to show the broad interaction picture. All of these interactions are supported by the implementation guide. The ability for a provider organization or a payer to communicate with and we're calling it coordination platform at the moment. We had some concern with the idea of calling it a community-based referral platform. So what we've done is call it a coordination platform based on some feedback from the platforms themselves. And we'll do that for right now. We can revisit it over time. And as long as we make a final decision on what we're going to call it before we publish the guide, we can be flexible. So next slide, please. Okay, we on the technical advisory committee call, we posited exchanges, additional ones, between the coordination platform and payers, providers, referral, other, should have referral platform, it should have been coordination platform down there. And next slide, please. And we got some feedback. We wanted to understand what people felt would be exchanged on a regular basis. And the answer was problems, goals, referral status, the interventions that are performed, and the referral directory information. There was less consistency in the belief that exchanges would happen broadly on survey and assessment. There were certain conditions under which that was important. On consent, there's a lot of variability in the industry around whether or not the exchange of a consent resource as opposed to understanding consent within an environment was important. And then there were some other aspects that were felt would be exchanged. Next slide, please. We spent some time looking at how we can provide technology standards for personal and limited technology users. We spent some time talking about the functionality that needed to be available. We were quite careful to make sure that we separated the three broad categories: the individual or their legal representative, the caregiver, who in this case would not be the legal representative, but somebody that is assisting in their care, and then a community-based organization that had little or no technology, someone that recorded things on paper, for example. Next slide, please. We focused on, and this is a very short version of the list that we developed, on what's necessarily required to support these three different categories of individuals and organizations. We talked about secure connections and authentication. We talked about secure control of SDOH information, the ability to retrieve referral information and share it, the ability to manage it. We're calling it a task list here, but a list of things to be done. And then some special things like the ability to support geolocation information for the patient or individual to understand where to go to get certain referred to help, the ability to update the status of the referral so we know where it is, what process it's in, has it been accepted, is it in process, has it been completed, if so, what was done, and then the ability to record specific services that were delivered, as well as the ability to indicate satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the service and an outcome. Next slide, please.
What about identity verification on that previous slide? Seems to me it comes before everything. How is that? How is that accommodated?
We're working with the FAST group, who is working on identity verification. We're not addressing it here specifically within this implementation guide. There are scalable things that have to be done in the industry. Identity verification is one. There are also other issues related to security standards. There are others related to directory information. We didn't intend to develop it within this implementation guide, but rather refer to the work that they're doing. Does that make sense?
You mentioned security on the previous slide, so that's why it came up in my little mind.
Yeah, fair enough. I think our only point there was these interactions, and some of that was based on the feedback from you, that these need to be secure interactions. The method by which you secure them is not something we'll address. We can add identity verification to that slide too, with the understanding that it would be something that we're going to rely on the work from Fire Scale Task Force to go and support. Okay?
That would be great. It just logically it comes first. The fact you don't have to invent any wheels here. Just let people know that everyone working on this is aware that identity verification is a critical functionality and has to come from somewhere.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. We'll add it to the slide.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Okay, we have reference implementation that's being developed. This is a draft of the user interface for it. The goal of it is to go and show how we can create, populate, and exchange these various fire resources that we're defining in the implementation guide. In this case, it supports the ability to define a patient or an individual, define assessments that have been asked for, completed, status of them, define goals, define interventions, and define the ability to support round-trip interventions or referrals so that we can understand the status of them and record their outcome. So these are all capabilities within the reference implementation. It'll be open source code and available to anyone that wants to either learn from it or take advantage of it. We're going to be using it in the Connectathon so that we have something reliable and repeatable to test against. It also helped us to go and, as we were building this reference implementation, to go and explore the actual implementation guide itself and determine whether we had places where we were making assumptions that didn't pan out when you started to write code to support it. Next slide, please. This is where we are. We have 198 of the 227 ballot comments completed as of the 30th of April. That's where we intended to be. The only things that are left are the ones related to the patient story. Because we're going to support more exchanges, we're developing some additional patient stories, and as we get those completed, we'll also complete those ballot comments. But everything else has a disposition. Most of them have been incorporated in the implementation guide, especially if they had an impact on the Connect-a-thon. Next slide, please. We will be having a track at the Connect-a-thon 27. The sign up for that closed on April 30th. We have 12 individuals and 8 organizations that are participating in the social determinants of health track that at least registered through the Confluence site to indicate what roles they would play. There may be others that come join us. And these are a number of specific roles that we're supporting: provider, coordination platform, community-based organization, the ability to go and create and administer and report on surveys, health information exchange, patient or caregiver application, and payer or payer HIT. And we have time to test all of these on the 2 days when we'll be doing the testing in the Connect-a-thon, which is on the 18th and 19th of next week. Next slide, please. CMS is going to conduct a Connect-a-thon also on July 20th through the 22nd. It'll be a virtual Connect-a-thon like HL7's. It will have a social determinants of health track. The track will only be on one of the 2 days, is our understanding at this point. It'll either be on the 21st or the 22nd. We'll get that squared away with the people that are organizing it and supporting it, and let people know which day it will be. There is no fee to participate in the CMS Connect-a-thon, unlike the HL7 Connect-a-thons. However, you'll have to sign up on the HL7 website. There's a link here by July 1st, end of day. At that point, they will close registration for the Connect-a-thon event. By the end of the first week of June, we will set up a Confluence site where those that are going to come and participate can declare the role they plan on playing, and we will make sure a link is available to you so that we can determine how many people want to bring code to the table, how many want to play the role of provider organization or coordination platform or community-based organization, etc. Next slide, please. And I believe that's the end of it. Do we have any items in the chat we need to respond to?
So Bob, I wonder if we can highlight the fact that the Connect-a-thon you're talking about is free, correct?
I did say that, and it's on the slide.
Well, yeah. So the only reason why I'm saying that is that it directly addresses a concern that was raised in our meetings regarding access, right? So we had, I do want to highlight that the community was very clear that there were some access barriers regarding cost to the HL7 Connect-a-thon. So consider these access barriers addressed intentionally, and we're very, very grateful.
Yes, we are. We're very grateful for CMS for providing a venue in which they're assuming all the costs. HL7 has its own method for conducting their Connect-a-thons.
Yeah, so this means we definitely want our, expert, our clients, our patient perspectives to be present so that we can get your perspective. We do really try to make sure we have representation, and that's a perfect time to come.
Okay, that's the end, I believe. Next slide, please.
We really have done our due diligence in this hour and a half. Next slide. Oddly enough, we don't actually have the vote here, I'm just realizing, but as always, submit concepts regarding social isolation. We had talked about social isolation from the adolescent perspective today, so please let us know if you have thoughts or concepts or submissions regarding that. Again, we're really in the gathering phase for social isolation and intimate partner violence and elder abuse right now. So if your community has tools that you use, if you have perspectives on critical diagnoses, please submit them formally through our submission process. My fear is we've become so expert at collating things for you all to respond to. There really are only a couple members who are submitting anymore. We have committed submitters. I want to highlight Lolita Jones, who is really just so dedicated to submitting concepts, and we're so grateful for her. So if you all can submit concepts, that's much appreciated. And then please do submit your votes. So all committed members to Gravity, submit your votes. And remember to submit comments if it's yes with comment or formal objection. And remember, if it's a formal objection, you need to offer a plan to address your objection. Thank you so much, everybody. An hour and a half well spent. Again, just an amazing meeting. We're very, very grateful for all of you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.